As you prepare to journey into the silent, pressurized world of the deep, let your breathing slow and synchronize with the rhythmic pulse of the tides. Imagine the weight of the day lifting, replaced by the gentle, supportive buoyancy of cool, dark water. You are safe, you are held, and you are about to descend into a realm where time moves differently, where the shadows are bioluminescent and the silence is a profound, comforting embrace. Close your eyes, let the surface world fade into a distant memory, and allow the currents of this story to carry you down into the peaceful depths of the unknown. The light in the city of Thalassa-Prime did not come from a sun or a moon, but from the rhythmic, pulsating hum of the great bioreactors that lined the obsidian walls of the abyssal trench, casting a soft, perpetual amber glow that clung to the edges of the glass domes like a golden moss. Silas Vance stood by the viewport of his apartment, a small, circular cell carved into the basalt of the ridge, and watched the slow drift of the siphonophores as they trailed their delicate, stinging lace across the dark expanse of the Hadal zone. It was a sight he had seen every morning of his 34 years, yet today, the geometry of the tentacles seemed to trace a pattern he had never noticed before, a complex mathematical sequence that felt less like biology and more like a set of encrypted coordinates. He adjusted the cuff of his pressurized tunic, the fabric a synthetic weave of eel silk and polymer that felt like a second skin, and leaned his forehead against the cold, reinforced silica of the pane. The pressure outside was enough to crush a steel beam into a toothpick, yet here, behind the miracle of Vernera engineering and modern structural integrity, there was only the sound of his own breathing and the distant, low-frequency thrum of the geothermal turbines. Silas was a sensory technician, a man whose entire existence was dedicated to ensuring that the artificial reality of Thalassa-Prime remained seamless for its 12,000 inhabitants, and yet, for the first time in his life, he felt a crack in the veneer. He began his walk toward the central hub, his boots clicking softly on the floor of the transparent corridor that snaked between the various sectors of the city. To his left, the residential domes clustered like clusters of translucent grapes, their interiors filled with the warm light of families waking up to their recycled oxygen and synthetic protein. To his right, the vastness of the Atlantic floor stretched away into the gloom, interrupted only by the occasional flash of a predator's lure or the steady, mechanical blink of a deep-sea mining drone. The architecture of the city was a strange marriage of Victorian opulence and dystopian utility. Brass fittings and velvet-lined bulkheads sat alongside flickering holographic displays and bundles of exposed fiber-optic nerves. It was as if Captain Nemo had survived his final voyage and decided to build a society using the logic of a paranoid mainframe. As Silas moved through the pressurized gates of Sector 4, he passed a group of children being taught by a rusted, spindle-legged automaton. The robot was reciting the history of the Great Submergence, its voice a gravelly playback of a recording that must have been a century old. It spoke of the melting ice, the rising tides, and the final, desperate descent of the chosen few into the sanctuary of the trench. But Silas lingered for a moment, listening to the static between the words, and he wondered if the static was also part of the lesson, a white noise designed to drown out the questions that no one was supposed to ask. The air in the central hub tasted of ozone and mint, a specific chemical cocktail designed by the Board of Atmospheric Stability to promote calm and productivity. Silas entered his workstation, a small alcove surrounded by monitors that displayed the vitals of the city's sensory grid. His job was to monitor the surface simulation, the massive, wraparound LED screens that covered the ceilings of the public squares, projecting a fake sky that transitioned from a pale dawn to a starry night. Most citizens of Thalassa-Prime had never seen the real sky, but they relied on the simulation for their circadian rhythms and their sanity. Today, however, there was a jitter in the western quadrant. A single pixel was stuck on a shade of electric blue that didn't exist in nature, a piercing, artificial hue that seemed to scream against the soft pastels of the simulated sunrise. Silas tapped his console, attempting to reset the node, but the pixel remained. It was a small flaw, a minor glitch in a system that managed millions of data points, but to Silas, it felt like a hole in the universe. He pulled up the diagnostic logs, his fingers flying across the haptic interface, and began to trace the origin of the signal. It didn't lead back to the central server in the core. Instead, it seemed to be feeding from an external source, a relay station located 5 miles outside the city perimeter, deep in the uncharted canyons of the volcanic shelf. As he worked, his supervisor, a man named Director Eris who smelled of old paper and sterilized metal, approached him with a gait that was too rhythmic to be entirely human. Eris leaned over Silas's shoulder, his eyes fixed on the flickering blue pixel. He didn't ask what was wrong, he simply watched, his breathing synchronized with the humming of the room. He told Silas that the pixel was a known anomaly, a phantom reflection of the geothermal vents, and that it should be ignored. The directive was delivered with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile that Silas recognized as a piece of pre-programmed social lubricant. Silas nodded, feigning compliance, but as Eris walked away, Silas noticed that the director's shadow didn't quite match his movements. It lingered for a fraction of a second too long on the floor, a dark silhouette that seemed to have a weight and an intent of its own. This was the Dickian rot at the heart of their underwater paradise, the suspicion that everything, from the air they breathed to the shadows they cast, was a curated experience designed to keep them from noticing the decay of the very foundation they stood upon. Silas spent the next several hours lost in a sea of technical manuals and architectural blueprints. He looked for any mention of the relay station in the canyons, but the records were scrubbed, replaced by vague descriptions of structural support pylons. He thought about the stories his grandfather used to tell him, stories not of the sea, but of a world where you could walk for miles without ever hitting a wall, where the ceiling was an infinite void of blue, and where the water didn't press against you, but fell from the sky in tiny, cooling droplets. His grandfather had been a dreamer, a man who collected surface artifacts, like rusted spoons and pieces of sun-bleached plastic. He had died in a reoxygenation accident when Silas was 12, a tragedy that the board had handled with a chilling, bureaucratic efficiency. Now, looking at that stubborn blue pixel, Silas felt the first stirrings of his grandfather's madness. He felt a desperate need to know if the sky was still there, or if they were merely living in a tomb that had been decorated to look like a womb. By the time his shift ended, the simulated sun was setting into a magnificent, crimson fake horizon. Silas didn't go back to his apartment. Instead, he made his way to the lower docks, a place of shadows and damp iron where the massive cargo submersibles were berthed and repaired. The air here was heavy with the smell of grease and salt, and the light was dim, provided by flickering gas lamps that felt like a deliberate nod to the Vernesque aesthetic of the city's founders. He sought out an old friend, a mechanic named Alara who spent her days welding the hulls of the exploration pods. Alara was a woman of few words. her face perpetually smudged with soot and her eyes sharp with a cynicism that Silas found comforting. He told her about the pixel and the relay station, his voice hushed against the sound of a nearby steam vent. Alara didn't laugh. She didn't even look surprised. She simply reached into the pocket of her heavy apron and pulled out a small, metallic object, a key, or perhaps a bypass chip, and pressed it into his hand. She told him that the Nautilus, the legendary prototype vessel that had supposedly been decommissioned decades ago, was still sitting in Bay 42, hidden behind a false bulkhead and a layer of bureaucratic red tape. She said that if he wanted to find the source of the glitch, he would need something that wasn't tethered to the city's central nervous system. The descent into Bay 42 was a journey through the layers of the city's history. Silas moved through corridors that became narrower and more primitive the further he went. The high-tech polymers of the upper levels gave way to riveted iron plates and heavy, oscillating valves. He felt like he was walking through the guts of a giant, prehistoric beast. When he finally reached the hidden hangar, he saw it, the Nautilus. It was a masterpiece of Victorian sci-fi, a cigar-shaped vessel made of iridescent steel, with a giant, circular eye of thick glass at the front. It looked both ancient and futuristic, a relic of a time when the future was something to be conquered, not survived. He climbed inside, the air smelling of cedarwood and old electricity. The controls were a dizzying array of brass levers, ivory dials, and glowing vacuum tubes. As he powered up the engines, the ship began to hum, a deep, resonant vibration that felt like a heartbeat. He wasn't a pilot, but he had spent his life studying the systems of the city, and the Nautilus spoke a language of physics and mechanics that he understood in his bones. He disengaged the docking clamps, the sound of metal on metal echoing through the empty bay, and steered the vessel out into the blackness of the abyss. Outside the city, the ocean was a different world. The silence was absolute, a heavy, physical presence that seemed to press in on the hull of the Nautilus. Silas turned off the external lights, relying on the bioluminescence of the deep-sea creatures to guide his way. He saw giant squids, their eyes the size of dinner plates, drifting through the dark like ghosts. He saw forests of tube worms that looked like alien skyscrapers, and thermal vents that belched out clouds of black smoke like the chimneys of a submerged London. He felt a sense of freedom he had never known, a terrifying, exhilarating weightlessness. But as he approached the coordinates of the relay station, the feeling of wonder was replaced by a growing sense of unease. The canyon walls began to narrow, and the water grew colder, the temperature gauges on the Nautilus dipping into the negatives. He saw structures that shouldn't exist, massive, geometric shapes that looked like the ruins of a city much older and much larger than Thalassa-Prime. These weren't the works of the founders. They were something else entirely, smooth, seamless towers of a dark, obsidian-like material that seemed to absorb the light. In the center of these ruins sat the relay station. It was a simple, silver sphere, suspended in the water by cables that vanished into the darkness above and below. It looked like a giant eye, watching the deep. Silas brought the Nautilus close, his heart hammering against his ribs. He deployed the ship's remote manipulator arm, a delicate claw of brass and hydraulics, and connected to the sphere's data port. His screens flooded with information, but it wasn't the technical data he expected. It was a stream of sensory input, the smell of rain on hot asphalt, the feeling of wind through grass, the blinding, terrifying brightness of a midday sun. It was the surface, but it was too real, too vivid. And then, he saw it, the glitch. In the middle of a perfect, digital image of a mountain range, the same electric blue pixel was flickering. But here, in the raw data, the pixel wasn't a flaw in the display, it was a leak. It was a gap in a massive, planetary-scale simulation. Silas realized with a sickening jolt that Thalassa-Prime wasn't an underwater city at all. Or rather, it was, but the ocean itself was part of the lie. He looked out the viewport of the Nautilus, and for the first time, he saw the water for what it was, a dense, liquid medium designed to simulate pressure and buoyancy, a containment fluid for a population that was being kept in a state of perpetual stasis. They weren't survivors of a flood, they were refugees from a reality that had become uninhabitable, or perhaps they were prisoners in a grand, existential experiment. The ruins around him were the remains of the processing units that maintained the illusion. He wasn't 5 miles away from the city. He was in the middle of its engine room. He thought of Director Eris and his lagging shadow, a rendering error. He thought of the Great Submergence, a narrative designed to justify their confinement. A voice crackled over the Nautilus's radio, a sound that shouldn't have been possible in the deep. It was the voice of Director Eris, but it wasn't the bureaucratic drone from the office. It was a voice that sounded like shifting sand and cracking ice. It told Silas that he had gone too far, that the truth was a burden that his mind wasn't designed to carry. The voice explained that the world above was gone, not flooded, but burned, a husk of a planet that could no longer support life. Thalassa-Prime was the only way to preserve the human experience, a collective dream maintained by 1,000 years of engineering and 1,000,000 lines of code. The glitches were the result of the system's inevitable entropy, the slow decay of the hardware that housed their souls. If Silas revealed what he had seen, the collective dream would collapse, and the 12,000 inhabitants of the city would wake up to a reality of cold, dark basalt and empty air. Silas sat in the quiet of the Nautilus, his hand resting on the brass throttle. He looked at the silver sphere, the source of their beautiful, artificial world. He could destroy it. He could trigger a cascade failure that would tear down the walls of Thalassa-Prime and show everyone the black, empty sky. Or he could return, fix the pixel, and spend the rest of his life in the amber glow of the bioreactors, listening to the rhythmic hum of the turbines and pretending that the shadows were real. He thought of his grandfather's rusted spoon, a relic from a world that didn't exist anymore, or perhaps a clue left behind by someone who had also found the edge of the map. He looked out at the ocean, at the beautiful, fake squids and the magnificent, fake ruins. It was a masterpiece of Victorian ambition and Philip K. Dick paranoia, a world where the only thing more terrifying than the lie was the truth. He began the long journey back to the city, the Nautilus moving slowly through the dark. He didn't turn the lights back on. He stayed in the shadows, watching the flickering bioluminescence and thinking about the nature of reality. Is a dream any less real if you never wake up? Is a home any less a home if it's built on a foundation of code and liquid? As he re-entered Bay 42, he saw Lara waiting for him, her face hidden in the gloom. She didn't ask what he found. She simply helped him secure the ship and lead him back into the iron guts of the lower levels. Silas went back to his apartment, back to his circular viewport. He watched the sunrise, the perfect, crimson, simulated sunrise, and he saw the blue pixel in the western quadrant. It was still there, a tiny, defiant hole in the sky. He didn't report it. He didn't try to fix it. Instead, he sat down and began to write, his pen moving across the synthetic paper in a frantic, rhythmic dance. He wrote about the Nautilus, about the Silver Sphere, and about the world that was burned and the world that was dreamed. He wrote a story for the children who were being taught by the spindle-legged robots, a story that would sit in the static between their lessons, waiting for the day when one of them would look at the sky and notice that the sun was a second too slow. The days that followed were a blur of routine and observation. Silas became a ghost within the machine, performing his duties with a precision that bordered on the mechanical. He monitored the oxygen levels, he calibrated the sensory arrays, and he attended the mandatory social gatherings where the citizens of Thalassa-Prime drank synthetic wine and talked about the surface, as if it were a promised land they would one day return to. He looked at their faces, at the genuine hope in their eyes, and he felt a profound, aching pity. They were happy in their ignorance, protected by the thick glass of their denial. He wondered if he was the only one who knew, or if there were others like him, technicians, mechanics, scholars, who had seen the cracks and chosen to stay silent. He began to notice subtle signs, a nod from a librarian, a lingering look from a gardener in the hydroponic domes, a specific sequence of lights in a window across the trench. They were a secret society of the disillusioned, the guardians of the lie. One evening, Silas found himself in the Cathedral of Currents, a massive, vaulted space at the very top of the central spire. The ceiling was a masterpiece of glass and steel, offering a panoramic view of the upper reaches of the trench. It was a place of meditation and prayer, where people came to listen to the voice of the ocean, a low-frequency recording of whale songs and tectonic shifts. As he sat on a bench of carved coral, he was approached by an elderly woman named Clara, who had once been the city's head of historical archives. She sat down beside him, her movements slow and deliberate, and she didn't look at him, she looked at the dark water above. She spoke of the early days of the city, of the men and women who had built the first domes using nothing but steam drills and a dream. She spoke of the Great Choice, the moment when the founders realized that the planet was dying and that the only way to save humanity was to hide it. She told him that the ocean was a metaphor, a way for the human mind to process the isolation and the pressure of their new existence. "We are not underwater, Silas," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "We are in a lifeboat, drifting through the stars, or perhaps we are in a vault, buried deep beneath the ash. The ocean is just the story we tell ourselves so we don't have to look at the void." Silas felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The idea that they weren't even on Earth, that the abyss was actually the vacuum of space or a subterranean bunker, added a new layer of horror to his discovery. It made the Vernes details, the brass, the velvet, the steam, seem even more absurd, a desperate attempt to cling to a Victorian sense of order in a universe that had become chaotic and unrecognizable. He asked her why they had chosen this specific aesthetic, why the world of 1870 was the template for their survival. Clara smiled, a sad, knowing expression. "Because," she said, "that was the last time we truly believed that technology would save us without destroying our souls. We chose the world of Jules Verne because it was a world of wonder and exploration, not a world of surveillance and entropy. We built a steampunk paradise to hide a cyberpunk nightmare." As the months turned into years, Silas became the curator of his own private reality. He continued to live in his basalt cell, he continued to work in the central hub, and he continued to watch the blue pixel. The pixel became his anchor, a constant reminder that there was something beyond the simulation, even if that something was a ruined world. He began to incorporate the truth into the surface simulation, but so subtly that no one noticed. He added a slight wobble to the stars, a faint scent of smoke to the evening breeze, a tiny, almost imperceptible shadow to the bright, midday sun. He was preparing them, slowly and carefully, for the day when the systems would finally fail. He was teaching them how to see the cracks, not as flaws but as doors. Eventually, Silas was promoted to Director of Sensory Operations, taking the place of Eris, who had retired, into a memory bank in the core. Silas now had the power to shape the collective dream of Thalassa-Prime. He could have fixed the glitches, he could have reinforced the illusion, but he chose a different path. He began to introduce anomalies into the city's history books, stories of explorers who had found the edge of the world, of ships that had sailed into the sky, of a sun that was once warm and a wind that was once wild. He turned the truth into a mythology, a series of fairy tales that would linger in the subconscious of the citizens. He wanted them to be ready for the awakening, whenever it might come. He wanted them to have the tools to navigate the void, even if the void was all that was left. On his final day, Silas returned to the Cathedral of Currents. He was an old man now, his hair as white as the foam on a simulated wave. He sat on the coral bench and looked up at the glass ceiling. The ocean was still there, dark and oppressive, but he no longer saw it as a prison. He saw it as a cocoon, a protective layer that had allowed the human spirit to survive the end of the world. He looked at the blue pixel, which had grown slightly larger over the decades, a glowing, electric sapphire in the heart of the fake sky. He reached out his hand, as if he could touch it, and he felt a sense of profound peace. He had done his job. He had maintained the dream, but he had also planted the seeds of the truth. He closed his eyes, his breathing slowing to a stop, and as he drifted into the final, true darkness, he heard the sound of rain, real rain, falling on a world he would never see, but a world he had never forgotten. On his final day, Silas returned to the Cathedral of Currents. He was an old man now, his hair as white as the foam on a simulated wave. He sat on the coral bench and looked up at the glass ceiling. The ocean was still there, dark and oppressive, but he no longer saw it as a prison. He saw it as a cocoon, a protective layer that had allowed the human spirit to survive the end of the world. He looked at the blue pixel, which had grown slightly larger over the decades, a glowing, electric sapphire in the heart of the fake sky. He reached out his hand, as if he could touch it, and he felt a sense of profound peace. He had done his job. He had maintained the dream, but he had also planted the seeds of the truth. He closed his eyes, his breathing slowing to a stop, and as he drifted into the final, true darkness, he heard the sound of rain, real rain, falling on a world he would never see, but a world he had never forgotten. The city of Thalassa-Prime continued to hum, its bioreactors pulsating with a golden light that never faded. The children continued to learn from the spindle-legged robots, and the families continued to eat their synthetic protein and watch the crimson suns set into the sea. But in the back of their minds, in the quiet moments before sleep, they all saw it, a tiny, blue pixel, flickering like a star in the deep. And they wondered, in the secret, unmapped corners of their hearts, if there was a world above the water, A world where the sky had no ceiling and the shadows were exactly as long as the things that cast them. They didn't know the truth, but they were no longer afraid of the dark. They were ready for the ascent, waiting for the moment when the glass would finally break and the dream would give way to the morning. In the quiet hours of the deep, the city seemed to breathe with a life of its own, a mechanical metabolism that processed the hopes and fears of its inhabitants into a steady, amber glow. Silas Vance's legacy lived on in the subtle shifts of the simulation, in the way the light hit the glass domes at dawn, and in the quiet, rhythmic tapping of the steam pipes that sounded, if one listened closely enough, like a heart beating in the dark. The ocean remained a mystery, a vast, pressurized void that both protected and confined them, a Vernesque stage for a Dickean drama that had no end. And somewhere, in the lightless canyons beyond the city walls, the Nautilus sat in its hidden bay, its brass fittings gleaming in the dark, waiting for the next dreamer to find the key and steer it out into the unknown. The deep was not a place of death, but a place of preservation, a sanctuary where the memory of the sun was kept alive in the flicker of a single, electric blue pixel. And as the tides of the simulation continued to rise and fall, the people of Thalassa-Prime slept, their dreams filled with the scent of ozone and mint, and the distant, comforting sound of a world that was waiting to be rediscovered. The narrative of the deep is one of silence and slow transitions, where the weight of the water acts as a buffer against the frantic pace of the surface. In Thalassa-Prime, the citizens moved with a deliberate, languid grace, their bodies attuned to the artificial rhythms of their aquatic home. They were a people of the shadow, defined by what they could not see as much as by what they could. The architecture of their lives was built on the principles of endurance and stability, a testament to the human will to survive in the most inhospitable of environments. And yet, beneath the surface of their contentment, there was always the hum, the low-frequency vibration of the machinery that kept the abyss at bay. It was a sound that one eventually stopped hearing, but its absence would have been a catastrophe, a sudden, violent realization of the fragility of their existence. Silas had understood this better than anyone. He had spent his life listening to the hum, diagnosing its fluctuations and smoothing out its inconsistencies. He knew that the line between a sanctuary and a tomb was as thin as the reinforced glass of the viewports. He had seen the way the pressure distorted the light, turning the familiar into the alien, and he had learned to find beauty in the distortion. For him, the city was a living organism, a complex system of gears and circuits that required constant attention and a certain amount of faith. He had been the doctor, the priest, and the mechanic of their collective soul, and in the end, he had realized that the greatest service he could provide was not the truth, but the possibility of the truth. As the story of Thalassa-Prime moves into its next cycle, the memory of Silas Vance fades into the static, becoming just another layer of the city's history. The new technicians walk the same corridors, monitor the same screens, and ignore the same blue pixel. But the seeds he planted continue to grow. In the hydroponic gardens, the plants are a little greener than they should be. In the schools, the stories are a little more vivid. And in the hearts of the people, the desire to look up, to search for the edge of the dream, has become a quiet, persistent ache. The ocean is still there, vast and indifferent, but it is no longer the only reality. There is the city, there is the abyss, and there is the blue pixel, the three pillars of a world that is slowly, inevitably, waking up.